What if your loyal dog uncovered a web of lies you never saw coming? What if your seemingly perfect partner was hiding something far darker than betrayal? This is the story of how my dog, Buster, became my savior in uncovering the chilling truth about my wife's double life. Secrets buried in the walls of our home, a conspiracy that could destroy me, and a nightmarish plan for revenge. Stay until the end to uncover how it all unraveled and how I made sure they paid the ultimate price. Trust me, you won't see this ending coming. Chapter 1. A fresh start in an old house. When Rachel and I moved into the old house on the outskirts of town, it felt like a chance to reset. Our marriage had been rocky for months, filled with arguments over small things that built into insurmountable walls. The house, with its creaking floors and ivy-covered exterior, was supposed to be our escape, a fresh canvas. But sometimes a fresh start only reveals stains you never noticed before. Buster, our Labrador, had always been a curious dog. From the moment we moved in, he seemed more interested in the house than we were. He'd sniff at the walls, scratch at the floorboards, and bark at the shadows cast by the swaying trees outside. I chalked it up to him adjusting to the new place, but looking back, I think he knew something I didn't. It started small. One evening, as I unpacked boxes in the living room, Buster dragged something from the garden and dropped it at my feet. A tarnished silver ring, engraved with initials I didn't recognize. I called Rachel over, joking that maybe we'd struck gold, but the way she looked at either face tightening for just a moment before she shrugged stuck with me. Probably just something the previous owners left behind, she said, tossing it aside like it meant nothing. The house itself seemed to carry a weight I couldn't explain. There were creaks and groans in the night that made my skin crawl. Doors that I swore I'd shut would be ajar in the morning. Rachel dismissed it all, saying I was overthinking, but Buster kept finding things. An old notebook stuffed between the floorboards, a child's toy buried in the garden, and then there was the photograph. Buster unearthed it one afternoon while I was mowing the lawn. A faded black and white picture of a woman standing in front of what looked like our house, her eyes piercing through the grainy image. She was holding a baby, but her expression wasn't one of joy. It was fear. "Creepy," Rachel said when I showed her, but again, she brushed it off. "You are letting this place get to you." Still, her dismissive attitude didn't sit right. I started to notice other things. How she'd leave the house late at night for errands. How she'd pull her phone away when I walked into the room. Little things that, on their own, might seem harmless, but together formed a picture I didn't want to see. Buster, on the other hand, seemed determined to dig up the truth literally. One night, as I lay awake in bed listening to Rachel's soft snores, I felt a growing unease I couldn't shake. I got up, wandering through the darkened house, and found Buster sitting by the basement door, whining softly. He never did that. Whatever was down there, he didn't like it. Neither did I. But curiosity got the better of me. Armed with a flashlight, I descended into the basement, Buster at my heels. The air was damp, and the walls were lined with old wooden shelves holding forgotten relics of the past. And then, in the corner, I saw it. A box, half buried under a pile of debris. Inside were items that made my blood run cold a knife, stained and rusty, and a bundle of papers I couldn't quite bring myself to read in that moment. Buster whimpered beside me, and I realized my hands were trembling. That was the night I stopped thinking of the house as a home. It was something else entirely. A tomb, maybe, or a stage for secrets waiting to be revealed. Chapter 2. Tension in the air. The honeymoon phase of our fresh start didn't last long. Rachel's coldness became more pronounced, her smiles less frequent. She was distracted all the time, her phone practically glued to her hand. I'd catch her staring out the window, her face drawn into an expression I couldn't quite place, something between guilt and fear. Buster, meanwhile, grew more restless. He'd patrol the house like a sentry, sniffing at corners and growling softly at shadows. At first, I thought he was just adjusting, but his behavior started to feel like a warning. And then there were the things he kept finding. One morning, while I was making coffee, Buster trotted in from the backyard with something in his mouth. At first glance, I thought it was another piece of junco rock or a stick. But when he dropped it at my feet, I realized it was a small, tarnished locket. Inside was a tiny photo of a man and woman I didn't recognize. The woman bore a striking resemblance to Rachel. When I showed her the locket, her reaction was strange. She didn't smile or laugh it off like she usually did. Instead, she stared at it for a long moment before snapping the clasp shut. "It's just old junk," she said curtly, shoving it into a drawer. "You are obsessing over nothing." But it didn't feel like nothing. Her behavior grew more erratic. She started spending more nights out, claiming she was running errands or meeting up with friends. When I asked why she always left so late, she rolled her eyes. Why do you care so much? I am not a child, Michael. It wasn't just her late nights. Rachel started avoiding me, in subtle ways turning away when I tried to kiss her, shrugging off conversations with one-word answers. It was as if a wall had sprung up between us overnight, and I couldn't see over it. One night, after she left for one of her errands, I decided to follow her. It felt ridiculous at first, like something out of a bad detective movie, but my gut told me there was more going on than she let on. I trailed her car at a safe distance, my heart pounding with each turn. She drove out of town, past the suburban streets, and into a more desolate area near the woods. She parked outside a small, dimly lit cafe. I watched as a man joined her at the table. At first, I thought maybe it was just an innocent meeting, but the way they leaned in close, the way she laughed a real laugh, the kind I hadn't heard from her in months that cut me to the core. They talked for over an hour. I couldn't hear them from where I sat in my car, but I didn't need to. The body language told me everything. She wasn't just cheating, she was happy about it. When she came home later that night, I tried to act normal, but everything about her, her smile, her casual small talk, her touch felt like a lie. I couldn't look at her the same way. The next day, Buster found something else. This time, it was an old photograph buried in the garden. It showed a group of people standing in front of what looked like our house. The faces were faded, but one stood out, a man in the center, his arm draped around a woman who looked eerily like Rachel. That night, as I lay in bed beside her, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was sleeping next to a stranger. Chapter 3. The House's Dark History. The photograph wouldn't leave my mind. It was grainy and faded, but the resemblance was too uncanny to ignore. The woman in the picture could have been Rachel's twin or her. I spent hours staring at it, trying to convince myself it was just a coincidence. But deep down, I knew better. Buster seemed to know something too. He'd grown fixated on the garden, pawing at the dirt near the old oak tree, as if there was something buried he couldn't reach. His low growls at night became more frequent, directed at corners of the house that seemed empty to me. I started wondering if the house itself was trying to tell me something and if Buster was the only one listening. Unable to shake my unease, I decided to do some digging. Literally. With a shovel in hand, I headed to the spot where Buster kept scratching. At first, it felt absurd, like I'd finally lost my grip. But after only a few minutes of digging, I hit something solid. It was a small rusted metal box, its hinges corroded with age. Inside, I found a collection of strange items. An old knife with a wooden handle, its blade mottled with rust, a yellowed envelope stuffed with black and white photographs, and a handwritten note that made my skin crawl. The note read, "The sins of the past never stay buried. Neither will she." I couldn't breathe. Who is she? Was it the woman in the photograph? And why did this feel like a warning meant for me? I took the photographs and the note inside, locking the box away in my desk drawer. Rachel wasn't home. She'd claimed she was going to the grocery store, but I knew better. She always came back hours later, the scent of cheap wine clinging to her clothes. That night, I couldn't sleep. I scoured the internet for anything I could find about our house's history. It didn't take long to uncover a story that sent chills down my spine. Years ago, the house had belonged to a couple, Margaret and Henry Clark. They were well known in the small town, picturesque family with their young daughter, Emily. But one day, Margaret disappeared without a trace. Henry claimed she had left him, but rumors swirled that something darker had happened. Some said she'd been murdered and buried on the property. Others whispered that Henry wasn't the only one involved in her disappearance. What made my blood run cold was the grainy newspaper photo that accompanied the article. It was the same image Buster had unearthed. Margaret Clark was the woman who looked exactly like Rachel. When Rachel came home that night, I couldn't meet her eyes. She noticed. "What's wrong with you?" she asked, her voice sharp. "Nothing," I muttered, forcing a smile. But the truth was clawing at my insides. Over the next few days, Buster's behavior grew even more erratic. He'd bark at nothing, his hackles raised, and scratch at the basement door as if something was down there. I finally gave in to his instincts and went down to investigate again. This time, I found something I'd missed before, a trapdoor hidden under a rotting rug in the corner. My flashlight beam wavered as I opened it, revealing a narrow staircase that descended into darkness. The air down there was colder, heavier. Buster whined but followed me, his loyalty outweighing his fear. At the bottom of the stairs was a small, windowless room. The walls were lined with shelves holding jars filled with murky liquids and objects I didn't recognize. In the center of the room was a wooden table, its surface scarred and stained. And there, hanging on the wall, was a photograph of Rachel. Not Margaret Clark, not some doppelganger. Rachel, my wife. I stumbled back, nearly dropping the flashlight. Buster growled low, his body tense. How could this be? Was it some kind of sick joke? Or was there more to Rachel's past than she'd ever let on? When I confronted her later that night, holding the photograph in my shaking hands, she froze. For the first time, she looked genuinely afraid. "Where did you get that?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. "The basement," I said, my voice cracking. "What the hell is going on, Rachel? Who are you?" She didn't answer. Instead, she grabbed her coat and fled into the night. And I was left alone in the house, the walls pressing in on me, the weight of the truth threatening to crush me. Chapter 4. The Invisible Enemy. The house felt emptier than ever after Rachel fled. The silence wasn't peaceful, it was suffocating. Every creak of the old floorboards, every faint rustle of the wind against the windows felt like it carried a sinister message. And Buster? He refused to leave my side, his every growl and whimper adding to my mounting paranoia. Rachel hadn't come back by morning, and I didn't call her. I wasn't sure I wanted her to return. Instead, I spent the day trying to piece together the fragments of the mystery I'd stumbled into. The note, the photographs, the trapdoor, it all pointed to a darker truth. But the more I thought about it, the less sense it made. How could Rachel be tied to a decades-old disappearance? That evening, I decided to look through the envelope of photographs Buster had unearthed. Most were innocuous family portraits, a birthday party, a picnic in the garden. But then I found a photo that stopped me cold. It was a picture of a man lying on the ground, his face contorted in pain. His shirt was soaked in what could only be blood, and standing over him was the woman I now knew as Margaret Clark. She held a knife in her hand, the same knife I'd found in the rusted box. But the most chilling part wasn't the image itself, it was the face of the man lying on the ground. He looked exactly like me. I stared at the photograph for what felt like hours, my mind racing. Was it a coincidence? A cruel trick of genetics? Or something far stranger? I couldn't explain it, and the more I tried, the more I felt the house itself pressing down on me like it was alive and watching. Buster barked suddenly, snapping me out of my thoughts. He was standing at the front door, his body tense, his growls low and menacing. I grabbed the baseball bat I kept by the door and peered out the window. There was no one there, but Buster wouldn't stop. He scratched at the door, barking louder, more insistent. I opened the door and stepped outside, the cool night air biting at my skin. The street was deserted, but Buster darted toward the side of the house, his nose to the ground. He led me to the garden, stopping at the base of the old oak tree where he'd first started digging. I froze when I saw it, a shallow grave, freshly disturbed. Someone had been digging there recently, and they'd left a spade sticking out of the dirt. My hand shook as I knelt and began to clear away the soil. Buster whined beside me, pacing nervously. And then, about 2 feet down, I found it. A bundle wrapped in plastic. With trembling hands, I tore it open, revealing a stack of papers. Most were old deeds and records for the house, but there was also a journal. The handwriting was neat and precise, and the first page was dated over 30 years ago. I skimmed through the entries, my heart racing. The journal belonged to Margaret Clark, and the things she wrote about chilled me to my core. She described her growing fear of her husband, Henry, who she claimed was abusive and controlling. She wrote about finding solace in the arms of another man who looked exactly like me. The entries grew darker as they went on. Margaret described how Henry found out about her affair and threatened to kill her. She wrote about planning to run away with her lover and their young daughter. But the final entry was short, scrawled in a shaky hand. "He knows. If you find this, please understand I had no choice." I leaned back, my mind spinning. This couldn't be real. It felt like a ghost story, some twisted fable meant to scare children. But the evidence was in my hands, and it pointed to something far more horrifying than I could comprehend. Suddenly, I heard a noise behind me, a soft rustling, like someone stepping through the grass. I turned, gripping the bat tightly, but no one was there. The garden was empty, bathed in pale moonlight. But Buster growled, his eyes fixed on something I couldn't see. And in that moment, I realized the enemy I was facing wasn't just Rachel's lies. It was something far older, something tied to the house itself. Chapter 5. Rachel's Return. Rachel came back 3 days later, just as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the house in long, eerie shadows. I heard the crunch of tires on the gravel driveway and froze. Buster, ever vigilant, stood by the door, his tail stiff, his growl low and guttural. I didn't know what I expected: an apology, an excuse, maybe even the truth, but when she walked through the door, it wasn't the woman I thought I knew. Rachel's face was pale, her eyes sunken and wild. She looked like someone who had spent those days running not just from me, but from something far worse. "I can explain," she said, her voice cracking. "Go ahead." My tone was cold, unfamiliar even to myself. The journal sat on the coffee table in plain sight, and her eyes flicked to it immediately. "Where did you get that?" she demanded, stepping toward it. "Buster found it," I said, gesturing to him. He sat at my feet, his gaze never leaving Rachel. "Seems like he's been uncovering all kinds of secrets lately. Care to share what the hell's going on?" Rachel hesitated, her hands trembling as she picked up the journal. For a moment, I thought she might deny everything, but then she sank into the armchair, her face buried in her hands. "I didn't want you to find out like this," she whispered. "Find out what? That you are cheating on me? That this house has some insane history that apparently includes you?" I stepped closer, anger bubbling to the surface. "Or maybe you can explain why it here is a photograph of you hanging in a hidden room in the basement from decades ago." Her head snapped up at that, her eyes wide. "You went down there? Answer me, Rachel." She let out a shuddering breath, and when she finally spoke, her words sent chills down my spine. "It's not me. It's Margaret, my grandmother." I stared at her, trying to process what she was saying. "Your grandmother?" "She lived here," Rachel continued, her voice unsteady. "I grew up hearing stories about this house, about her. She was different. People in town said she was cursed, or that she'd cursed this place. But it wasn't her fault. She was trapped here by Henry, by this house, by everything." I wanted to believe her, but something about her explanation felt off. "Why didn't you tell me? Why bring me here if you knew the history?" Rachel hesitated again, and that hesitation told me everything. "You didn't just stumble onto this house, did you?" I said, my voice low. "You wanted to come here. Why?" Her eyes welled with tears, and she looked down at the journal in her hands. I thought I could fix it. Break whatever's binding this place, set things right." I laughed bitterly. "Fix it? Rachel, since the day we moved in, this house has been tearing us apart, and you think you can just fix it?" "It's not the house," she snapped, her voice rising. "It's him." "Who?" "Henry," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "He's still here. His anger, his hatred, it's soaked into these walls. And now he's watching us." I felt the blood drain from my face. I wanted to accuse her of being insane, but deep down, I knew she wasn't lying. The strange noises, the unease, the sense of being watched, it all made sense in a way I wished it didn't. "And the man you've been seeing?" I asked, my voice hard. "Is he part of this too?" Her face crumpled, and she shook her head. "It's not what you think. He's helping me. He's a historian, someone who knows the truth about this place. I needed him to figure out how to stop it." "You expect me to believe that?" "I don't care if you believe it," she said, standing up, her eyes blazing with something between desperation and defiance. "But if we don't deal with this, it's going to destroy us, just like it destroyed them." Her words hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. I didn't trust her, not fully, but there was something in her voice, in the way her hands trembled, that made me realize she was afraid. Not of me, not even of her lies. She was afraid of whatever was lurking in this house. Chapter 6. Unseen Forces. The house felt alive that night, breathing and shifting with a presence that no longer tried to hide itself. Rachel's confession had left a rift between us, but there was no time to dwell on it. The journal, the photographs, the cryptic warnings, they all painted a picture I wasn't ready to face. Yet, the evidence was undeniable. We weren't alone. I barely slept, my mind replaying Rachel's words. He's still here. Was she right? Was Henry Clark's rage somehow woven into the fabric of this house? Buster barked sharply, jerking me awake. His gaze was locked on the corner of the bedroom, his teeth bared. I grabbed the flashlight from the nightstand and shone it where he was staring. The beam landed on the closet door, slightly ajar. "Stay here," I whispered to Rachel, who sat up, her eyes wide with fear. I moved toward the closet, each step heavier than the last. My hand trembled as I reached for the door handle, yanking it open. Nothing, just clothes and an old box of Rachel's belongings. But then I heard it. A faint whisper, so low it could have been the wind, only it wasn't coming from the closet. It was coming from the walls. Rachel gasped behind me, and I turned to see her clutching the journal. "Michael," she said, her voice trembling, Look at this. She flipped to one of the last pages where a sketch had been hastily drawn a crude outline of the house. Certain rooms were marked with small X's. These are spots where Margaret said she felt him strongest, Rachel explained. One of the X's was over our bedroom. Before I could respond, the room grew colder. The temperature plummeted so fast I could see my breath. Buster whimpered and backed toward the bed, his ears flat against his head. The air was heavy, pressing down on my chest. Then came the sound, a deep, guttural groan, like the house itself was in pain. It reverberated through the walls, growing louder until I had to cover my ears. "Get out!" Rachel screamed, grabbing my arm. We stumbled into the hallway, Buster at our heels. But the moment we stepped outside the bedroom, the door slammed shut behind us with a deafening crash. "Michael? What's happening?" Rachel's voice was panicked, tears streaming down her face. I didn't have an answer. The house was alive, and it didn't want us there. We retreated to the living room, huddled together with Buster between us. The groaning sound had stopped, but the oppressive silence that followed was somehow worse. "We can't stay here," I said finally, my voice hoarse. Rachel shook her head. "We can't leave either, not until we finish this." Her resolve surprised me. After everything, she was still determined to face whatever horrors this house held. But I wasn't convinced we'd survive the night. We decided to investigate the marked spots on Margaret's map, hoping to find some clue to end this nightmare. The next X was in the dining room. The air grew colder as we entered, the shadows stretching unnaturally across the walls. Buster growled, his hackles raised, but he stayed close. In the corner of the room, a floorboard creaked. I knelt and pried it up, revealing a small compartment beneath. Inside was another envelope, this one labeled Confession. Rachel hesitated before opening it. Her hands shook as she unfolded the brittle paper and began to read aloud. "To whoever finds this, I am sorry. I couldn't stop him. His anger consumes his place, and now it consumes me. I've tried to make peace, but he won't let me go. If you are reading this, leave. Burn it all and never look back." The letter was signed by Margaret Clark. Rachel looked at me, her face pale. "She's warning us." "Or trying to trap us?" I muttered, staring at the letter. Before we could decide our next move, the lights flickered and went out, plunging the room into darkness. A loud crash echoed from the basement, followed by the sound of shattering glass. And then came the voice, a deep, guttural whisper that sent chills down my spine. "You are not welcome here." The house was no longer just haunted. It was angry. Chapter 7. The Basement. The voice lingered in the air, wrapping itself around me like a suffocating fog. Rachel clutched my arm, her nails digging into my skin. Buster stood rigid, his growls echoing in the stillness. The house was silent again, but it wasn't a calm silence. It was the kind of quiet that made you hyper-aware of every breath, every heartbeat. Then came the sound of rhythmic pounding from below, like someone hammering against the foundation of the house. Rachel and I exchanged a glance. She didn't need to say it, I already knew. The basement was calling us. Armed with a flashlight and a crowbar I'd grabbed from the shed earlier, I led the way. Buster followed closely, his low growls a constant reassurance that I wasn't imagining the menace in the air. Rachel trailed behind, holding the journal like a shield. The basement door was open, swaying gently, as though it had been expecting us. I hesitated, the crowbar slippery in my sweaty grip. Every instinct screamed at me to turn back, to leave this cursed place behind. But Rachel's hand on my shoulder steadied me. "We have to do this," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. The stairs groaned under our weight as we descended. The air grew colder with each step, and the familiar damp, earthy smell of the basement was now tinged with something metallic like blood. At the bottom, the flashlight beam wavered over the walls, revealing the strange jars and objects I'd seen before. But this time, something was different. The table in the center of the room was no longer empty. A single candle burned there, its flame flickering unnaturally. Beside it was a framed photography I hadn't seen before. It was Rachel, but younger, standing next to an older woman I recognized as Margaret Clark. Rachel gasped. "That's not possible. I've never seen this photo before." Before I could respond, the pounding sound returned, louder now, vibrating through the walls. Buster barked furiously, his tail tucked between his legs as he snarled at the far corner of the room. The trapdoor. It had slammed shut the last time I'd been down here, but now it was slightly ajar, a faint, flickering light emanating from below. "Don't," Rachel said, grabbing my arm. "Please, Michael, we don't need to go down there. Yes, we do, I said, surprising myself with the steadiness in my voice. This ends tonight. With a deep breath, I pried the trapdoor open, revealing the narrow staircase descending into an even darker void. The smell hit me first a foul, decaying stench that turned my stomach. Rachel tried to stop me again, but I was already halfway down. The walls here were rough, unfinished, the air heavy with moisture. At the bottom, the room opened into a cavernous space that shouldn't have been there. It was far larger than the footprint of the house. In the center was a crude altar, surrounded by symbols carved into the dirt floor. On the altar lay a skeletal figure, bound with rusted chains. The skull was cracked, the eye sockets staring into the abyss. Rachel let out a strangled cry behind me. "It's him, Henry." Before I could respond, the room seemed to shift. The walls pulsed, the carved symbols glowing faintly as the temperature plummeted. And then, from the shadows, he emerged. A towering figure, shrouded in darkness, his form barely human, his eyes burned with a malevolent light, his voice a guttural growl that echoed in my mind. "You will not take her from me." Rachel screamed, and I stepped in front of her, holding the crowbar like it could actually protect us. Buster lunged, barking ferociously, but the figure didn't flinch. Instead, it reached for Rachel, its shadowy arm extending unnaturally toward her. "Run!" I shouted, pushing her toward the stairs. But she didn't move. Her gaze was locked on the figure, her expression one of terror and recognition. "It's him," she whispered. "He's been here all along." I swung the crowbar, and it passed through the figure, as though he were made of smoke. His laugh was a deep, bone-rattling sound, filled with centuries of rage. "You cannot stop this," he snarled. "She is mine." Rachel clutched the journal to her chest, flipping through the pages frantically. "There has to be something here," she muttered, her voice trembling. The figure turned its attention to me, its glowing eyes locking onto mine. "You are not part of this," it said. "Leave, and you may yet survive." But I couldn't Leavenot without Rachel. The journal slipped from her hands, falling open to a page near the end. The words were written in red ink, stark against the yellowed paper. "Destroy the heart, and the curse will break." "Rachel!" I shouted, pointing to the altar. "It's him. The body his heart." She hesitated for only a moment before nodding. Together, we lunged for the altar. The figure roared, the cavern shaking violently as he tried to stop us. With Buster snapping at the figure's heels and Rachel holding back tears, I grabbed the knife from the altar and plunged it into the skeletal remains. The room erupted in a blinding light, the figure's scream piercing through the chaos. The ground shook, and the walls began to collapse. We barely made it out, the trapdoor slamming shut behind us as the basement filled with dust and debris. For the first time since we'd moved in, the house was silent. Chapter 8. The Aftermath. The house was eerily quiet, the kind of silence that felt unnatural after the chaos in the basement. The oppressive weight in the air had lifted, but the echoes of what had happened lingered. Rachel and I sat in the living room, trembling and covered in dust. Buster lay at our feet, exhausted but watchful, his ears twitching at every faint creak of the house settling. "Do you think it's over?" Rachel's voice broke the silence, barely audible. I looked at her, unsure how to answer. "It feels different," I admitted, "but I don't know." We had destroyed the skeletal remains in the basement, the supposed heart of the curse, but I couldn't shake the feeling that the house wasn't done with us. Rachel picked up the journal, flipping through the brittle pages. "She warned us," she whispered. "Margaret knew what this place was capable of." "Do you believe her?" I asked. "That it's over?" She hesitated, her fingers brushing against the photograph tucked inside the journal of one of her and Margaret. "I don't know," she said finally, "but I think she was trying to protect us." The lights flickered for a moment before stabilizing, a reminder that, though the malevolent presence seemed gone, the house itself remained alive in its own way. "Michael," Rachel said, her voice trembling, "here is something I need to tell you." I braced myself, unsure of what more there could possibly be. "The historian I was meeting," she began, avoiding my gaze. "He wasn't just helping me with the house. He was helping me uncover secrets about my family. Things my parents never told me. About Margaret. About Henry." "What kind of secrets?" She hesitated, then handed me the journal, pointing to a passage near the beginning. "Margaret didn't just marry Henry," Rachel explained. "She was forced into it. He was obsessed with her, and when she tried to leave, Her voice broke, and I read the passage myself. It detailed Henry's descent into madness, his violent outbursts, and his determination to keep Margaret with him at all costs. She tried to run, Rachel said, tears streaming down her face. But he found her. He dragged her back here and locked her in that basement. That's why she wrote all this. She wanted someone to know what happened to her. A chill ran down my spine as the pieces clicked into place. The curse, the rage, the malevolent presence, it all stemmed from Henry's obsession and the darkness he had brought into this house. Rachel, I said carefully, why didn't you tell me any of this before? She shook her head, her voice barely above a whisper. Because I thought I could fix it on my own. I thought if I figured out the truth, I could save us. Her words hung in the air, heavy with regret. Before I could respond, Buster let out a low growl, his eyes fixed on the far corner of the room. My heart raced as I turned, expecting to see something or someone lurking in the shadows. But there was nothing. Maybe we should leave, I said, standing up. Get out of this place and never come back. Rachel looked at me, her expression unreadable. If we leave, who will stop this from happening again? What if someone else moves in and... I didn't have an answer for her. All I knew was that this house had taken too much from us already. That night, we packed our belongings, leaving behind the furniture, the trinkets, even the journal. As I closed the front door for the last time, I couldn't help but feel like the house was watching us, its silent gaze following us down the driveway. The drive away from the house was quiet. Rachel stared out the window, her face pale and drawn. Buster sat between us, his head resting on my lap, as though sensing the end of something monumental. We didn't speak much after that. There was too much to process, too many unanswered questions. But as we pulled onto the highway, a single thought kept gnawing at the back of my mind. Was it truly over? Chapter 9. A New Beginning. The first few weeks after leaving the house were unnervingly quiet. Rachel and I rented a small apartment on the outskirts of town, far enough to put distance between us and the horrors we'd endured, but close enough to remind us that our escape wasn't truly complete. Rachel seemed distant but determined, throwing herself into researching Margaret Clark's history. She claimed it was for closure, but I could tell it was more than that. She was looking for something, though she wouldn't tell me what. I, on the other hand, wanted nothing more than to forget. I took on more shifts at work, trying to drown out the memories in the monotony of daily life. But no matter how much I tried, the house clung to me like a shadow. Buster wasn't the same either. He'd always been a lively, curious dog, but now he was restless, pacing the apartment and barking at the windows as if expecting someone to appear. One night, I came home late to find Rachel at the kitchen table, the journal spread out before her. She had pinned photographs and handwritten notes to the wall, creating a chaotic map of connections and timelines. "What is this?" I asked, dropping my bag by the door. She didn't look up. "I think T here is more to the story," she said, her voice low and focused. "Margaret didn't just suffer under Henry. She fought back. She tried to stop him." I sighed, running a hand through my hair. "Rachel, we left that house for a reason. Why are you still digging into this?" "Because it's not over," she said, finally meeting my gaze. Her eyes were bloodshot, dark circles beneath them betraying sleepless nights. "Don't you feel it, Michael? He's still with us." Her words sent a chill down my spine. I wanted to dismiss her fears, to tell her she was imagining things. But deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that she was right. That night, I dreamt of the house. It stood silent and foreboding under a blood-red sky, its windows like empty eyes watching me. I saw Rachel inside, standing in the basement, her hands pressed against the walls as they pulsed with life. She turned to me, her face pale and expressionless, and whispered, "You should have burned it." I woke in a cold sweat, my heart pounding. Buster was at the foot of the bed, growling softly at the door. "Rachel?" I called out, but the other side of the bed was empty. I found her in the living room, standing by the window. The journal was on the floor at her feet, its pages scattered like fallen leaves. She didn't turn as I approached. "What's going on?" I asked, placing a hand on her shoulder. "I saw him," she said, her voice trembling. "In the reflection of the glass. He's here, Michael. He followed us." Her words hit me like a punch to the gut. I wanted to believe she was just exhausted, that her mind was playing tricks on her, but the look in her eyes told me otherwise. Over the next few days, strange things began happening. Lights flickered inexplicably. Objects moved on their own. Buster refused to enter certain rooms, growling at invisible forces. Rachel grew more withdrawn, spending hours poring over the journal. She became obsessed with the idea that we hadn't truly ended Henry's curse, that something had been left unfinished. One evening, she approached me with a plan. "We need to go back," she said, her voice resolute. What? I stared at her, incredulous. You can't be serious. We didn't destroy it, she insisted. The journal says the curse can only be broken by fire. We have to burn the house. Her words sent a wave of dread through me. The thought of stepping foot in that house again made my skin crawl. But as much as I hated to admit it, she was right. The strange occurrences weren't stopping, they were escalating. And deep down, I knew they wouldn't until we finished what we'd started. Reluctantly, I agreed. We packed a few supplies and drove back to the house under the cover of night. As we approached, the sight of the old, dilapidated structure sent a shiver down my spine. The house loomed in the darkness, its windows glowing faintly as though it were alive. The front door creaked open on its own as we stepped onto the porch, an unspoken invitation. "Are you ready?" Rachel asked, holding a canister of gasoline. "No," I admitted. "But let's do it anyway." As we entered the house, the air grew heavy, pressing down on us with an almost physical weight. The walls seemed to shift, the shadows moving in ways they shouldn't. Buster barked furiously, refusing to step inside. He stood on the porch, his eyes locked on something we couldn't see. Rachel began pouring gasoline across the floor, her movements quick and deliberate. I followed her lead, dousing the furniture, the walls, the cursed basement door. As we worked, the house came alive around us. Doors slammed shut, the floorboards groaned, and whispers filled the air. But we didn't stop. When the last corner of the house was soaked, Rachel turned to me, a box of matches in her hand. "This is it," she said. I nodded, my heart racing. She struck the match, its small flame flickering in the darkness. "Let's end this," she said, tossing it onto the gasoline-soaked floor. The fire caught instantly, roaring to life and spreading with unnatural speed. The house screamed around us, its walls shaking as though it were trying to hold itself together. We ran, the flames chasing us out the front door. Buster barked wildly as we stumbled onto the lawn, watching as the house was consumed in a fiery inferno. For a moment, it almost looked like a figure stood in the flames, watching us with glowing eyes. And then, it was gone. Chapter 10. The Truth Revealed. The fire raged through the night, reducing the house to ash and charred wood. We stood on the edge of the lawn, watching as the flames devoured everything. The sound of sirens echoed in the distance, but neither of us moved to call for help. This wasn't something we wanted to explain. Rachel clung to my arm, her face pale and tear-streaked. "It's done," she whispered, almost as if trying to convince herself. Buster sat at our feet, his ears perked but his body relaxed for the first time in weeks. He seemed to sense the shift, the release of whatever dark energy had clung to us for so long. When the fire finally died out, the house was nothing more than smoldering rubble. The oppressive presence that had haunted us seemed to dissipate with the smoke. And yet, something inside me remained unsettled. The following day, we returned to the site. The air was thick with the smell of burnt wood and damp earth. Ashes coated the ground, and the basement had caved in, leaving a jagged crater where the house once stood. Rachel moved cautiously, her gaze darting to the ruins as if expecting something to emerge. I followed her lead, stepping carefully over the debris. "What are we looking for?" I asked, my voice breaking the eerie silence. "Proof," she said simply. "Proof of what?" "That it's really over." We sifted through the wreckage, though I wasn't sure what we hoped to find. The fire had destroyed nearly everything, leaving behind only fragments of what had once been. Then Rachel froze. "Michael," she called, her voice trembling. I hurried to her side, my heart pounding. She was crouched by a partially collapsed wall, her hand resting on a scorched metal box. "What is it?" I asked. She opened the box, revealing its contents a stack of photographs, their edges curled and blackened. Among them were images of Margaret Clark, her face solemn and weary. But what caught my attention was the figure standing beside her in one of the photographs. It was Rachel. My stomach dropped. That's impossible. Rachel's hands trembled as she held the photograph closer. "It can't be," she murmured. "This isn't me. It's someone else." The resemblance was uncanny, down to the curve of her smile and the way her hair fell across her shoulders. But the photograph was dated 1906. My mind raced, trying to make sense of it. Maybe it's a relative. I offered, though the words felt hollow. Rachel shook her head. "Number T here is something more. Something Margaret didn't tell us." As we continued searching, we uncovered more strange artifacts: a charred locket containing a lock of hair, a diary with pages too damaged to read, and a small, rusted key. It was Rachel who pieced it together first. "This isn't just about Margaret," she said, her voice filled with conviction. It's about us. We're connected to this place in ways we don't understand. Her words sent a chill down my spine. I wanted to argue, to dismiss her theory as paranoia, but deep down, I knew she was right. The house had targeted us for a reason, and it wasn't just random misfortune. That night, back at the apartment, Rachel spread the photographs and artifacts across the table, studying them with an intensity I'd never seen before. "What if Margaret knew I'd come back?" she said suddenly. I frowned. "What are you talking about?" "She left these things for me," Rachel said, gesturing to the charred remains of the diary and the locket. "She knew I'd find them. Maybe she wanted me to." The idea was absurd, and yet it explained so much. The journal, the photographs, the lingering presence of Henriette all pointed to a connection that went deeper than we could have imagined. Rachel leaned forward, her eyes filled with determination. "We need to find out the truth, Michael. About Margaret, about me, about why this all happened." I hesitated, the weight of her words sinking in. We had burned the house, but the story wasn't over. It had just begun. Chapter 11. The Final Revelation. The days following the fire were a blur of unease and unanswered questions. Rachel's obsession with uncovering the truth deepened, and I found myself dragged further into her quest, unable to resist the pull of what felt like an inevitable reckoning. She pored over the artifacts we had salvaged, her focus narrowing on the rusted key. It was small and unassuming, but Rachel was convinced it was the missing piece to everything. "Where does it fit?" I asked one evening as she turned it over in her hands for the 100th time. "I think I know," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. We drove out to the local historical society the next morning, a small, dimly lit building filled with old records and dusty archives. Rachel had discovered through her research that Margaret Clark had a safety deposit box at a long-defunct bank in town. The records had been transferred here decades ago. After hours of digging, we found the box in a back room, stored among other forgotten items. Rachel's hands shook as she slid the key into the lock. It fit perfectly. The box creaked open, revealing its contents. A stack of letters tied with a faded ribbon, a leather-bound journal, and a delicate silver necklace with a single blood-red gemstone. Rachel picked up the journal first, her fingers tracing its worn cover. She opened it carefully, the brittle pages threatening to crumble under her touch. The entries were written in Margaret's familiar handwriting, but the tone was turgent, desperate. "If you are reading this, you must understand. The curse is not bound to the house alone. It is tied to blood, to family, to the choices we make. My greatest sin was loving him, and my greatest mistake was staying. But I will not let him have the final word." Rachel read aloud, her voice trembling. "It's about Henry," she said, flipping through the pages. "He cursed himself, but in doing so, he cursed everyone connected to him by blood or by love." My stomach turned. "What does that mean for us?" She looked at me, her face pale. "It means we were always a part of this." The letters in the box revealed even more. Margaret had discovered the curse too late, after Henry's obsession had twisted into violence. She had written to a distant relative, a woman named Eleanor Clark, begging for help. But Eleanor's response was chilling. "You cannot outrun what is in your blood. The only way to break the chain is to end it entirely. Destroy all traces of him, and never look back." Rachel's hands tightened around the letters. "Eleanor was my great-great-grandmother," she said quietly. The pieces clicked into place. Rachel wasn't just connected to Margaret by chance as she was her descendant. The curse had followed her family for generations, waiting for an opportunity to resurface. "What about the necklace?" I asked, gesturing to the silver chain. Rachel hesitated before picking it up. The gemstone seemed to pulse faintly in the dim light, like a heartbeat. The final entry in Margaret's journal provided the answer. "This is the key to breaking the curse, but it comes at a cost. It must be worn by one of my blood, and the sacrifice must be made willingly. Only then will the curse end." I stared at Rachel, the weight of Margaret's words sinking in. "Sacrifice? What kind of sacrifice?" Rachel shook her head, tears welling in her eyes. "I don't know, but if it's the only way to end this—" "No," I said firmly. "We've already lost so much. There has to be another way." But Rachel was resolute. "If we don't do this, it'll keep going. It'll find someone else, someone innocent. We have to end it." We returned to the ruins of the house that night, the necklace clutched tightly in Rachel's hand. The air was cold and still, the kind of quiet that felt alive with anticipation. Rachel stood at the edge of the crater, the moonlight casting her in an ethereal glow. She placed the necklace around her neck, the gemstone glowing brighter with every passing second. "What now?" I asked, my voice barely audible. She turned to me, her eyes filled with a mixture of fear and determination. I think it's waiting for me to choose. Before I could stop her, she stepped into the center of the crater. The ground beneath her began to tremble, the air filling with a low, guttural hum. "Rachel!" I shouted, reaching for her. She turned to me one last time, a sad smile on her face. "It's okay, Michael. It's finally over." The gemstone blazed with light, engulfing her in a radiant glow. The hum grew louder, drowning out everything else. And then, in an instant, she was gone. The ground stilled, the light fading into darkness. I stood there staring at the empty space where Rachel had been, my heart shattered. But the oppressive presence was gone. The curse, it seemed, had been broken. In the weeks that followed, I struggled to come to terms with what had happened. Rachel had sacrificed herself to end the curse, to save others from the torment we had endured. I kept the journal and the letters, a reminder of her bravery and the legacy she had carried. But the necklace was gone, its purpose fulfilled. Even now, I wonder if I could have stopped her, if there was another way. But deep down, I know the truth. She did what she had to do. And in the end, Rachel saved us all. What would you have done in Rachel's place? Would you have made the same sacrifice, or would you have tried to find another way? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. And if this story resonated with you, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share. Here is always more to uncover, and your support helps us keep exploring the unknown.